Good morning. Hope you're having a good week and a good start to your day. Today we have a really great presenter that we're super excited about. And as always, before we do that, we will have a couple quick updates for you. Dr. Huja, thank you so much for joining us every week. I know that you're going to ask some other colleagues, Dr. Will Collins, to also help us with updates weekly as well. So thank you so much for sticking with us every week, and you'll continue to join us and help answer questions as needed as well. But thanks so much for all the updates, and here's the updates from me today.
Thank you, Errol, and it has been a pleasure. Talia, as we go to the next slide, I'm happy to share with you that overall our numbers have gone down. As you can see across the country, there are some hot spots in the U.S., across the U.S., and then across the globe, you can see Europe, and we'll talk about that in a second. On the next slide, we'll see that as the US numbers come down, unfortunately, the Europe numbers are coming up. And, this is on the next slide. This is our SHC numbers, and the total is in orange, and you can see that continuous trend since we hit our peak in late July. So that's nice to see. This week, the ICU numbers had been a little higher in proportion to the ward numbers. And on the next slide, I'll show you the absolute numbers. We have now 454 were admitted to SHC with symptoms since March, September 20th. Of those, you can see that our ICU numbers remain stable at their percentage of about 20. And the death rate has actually, over the past few months, slowly creeped up from low 5s to now 6%. So we'll continue to watch that trend. On the next slide, you'll see the gender breakdown, and that's been stable, and that does include our pregnant patients that are admitted to our service, and then the age distribution as well, which you. On the next slide, you'll find our total number of deaths are now 31, and of them, there's a more male predominance, which is consistent with the global trends as well. The minimum age was actually 29, the maximum age 94, with a median age of 74, and you can see the interquartile range here. On the next slide, this is the breakdown of the deaths by age and gender, and we've talked about this every week. We'll watch the trend, but we do on the younger population as well. And then finally, on the last slide, I want to thank my data team, and if you could please advance one more slide. I have enjoyed giving you these updates every week for the past 6 months. I'm going to pass the baton over next patients as well in the hospital medicine service, and has actually helped me over the months to occasionally validate some of the numbers with chart reviews. So you'll be in good hands with his updates, and thank you very much.
Thanks again, Dr. Huja, for joining us every week. I know she mentioned earlier your internet, you came in and out a little bit, but we hear most of you lost your this morning, so you're on the hotspot, but we got most of it. So thank you so much, and for sharing the slides. Again, thanks for joining us every week, and I know you'll continue to stick with us and help answer questions as needed as well. And next, you mentioned last week that Dr. Song Chang turned over the running occupational health to Dr. Brian Bowman. So again, Song, thanks so much for everything you've done. And thanks again, Dr. Bowman, for joining us today and providing some updates from occupational health.
Thanks, Errol, and thanks, Song, for an amazing amount of work he's done over the last few months. And I'm following in his large footsteps and trying to wrap my arms around the occupational health aspect of COVID here. I thought I would give just a little more context to add to what Neera showed you. In terms of what's going on nationally, you can see that we do have a little bit of an uptick, maybe the post-Labor Day mini surge. Who knows if it's mini or maxi until we see the future. Or maybe it's just the fall and winter coming, but it's concerning, especially since it's happening at a level, as you can see, that is much higher than the previous nadir around middle of June. So we're watching that. This is a heat map of just where the activity is throughout the United States, mostly Midwestern and Southeast, as you can see. And then within California, you can see where there's activity as well, mostly relatively good in the Bay Area, And I'll show you a little bit about that. Our two main counties, Santa Clara, the trends are still good. There's a slight uptick at the end, but that's premature to say anything about. San Mateo similarly. And so here are our numbers. Ignore this last data point. That's just one day of this current week. But if you look at the full weeks, there was a little bit of an uptick last week. And again, I don't think we know what to make about that until we see the next week or so. But overall, I would say the trends are really good. I wanted to report out to this group about a pilot study we did of mid-turbinate self-swab testing, which I couldn't find the exact performance data for that testing, but I think if the routine of the previous gold standard nasopharyngeal swab was 97 or 8% sensitive, this is like 1% less sensitive in our testing. So of the 828 tests we performed, 0 were positive, which is reassuring. Hopefully we'll have this as a tool should we need to take testing to the wards. If there's an outbreak on a ward or anything like that, we'll be ready for that. And then finally, I thought I'd share these numbers from Stanford University. Remarkably low incidence in our university community, 0.16% since they started testing. If you look at this chart, you can see a lot of those early positives, a lot of their positives were early in July during that surge that we had. And if you look at just the last 3 weeks, 0.03% incidence in the asymptomatic university population. That's it. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Dr. Bowman. And if you do have any questions, please put them in and we'll ask Dr. Bowman, Hujas, and our other panelists to answer those in type. And of course, save the questions for our main presenter to address after he's done presenting. I want to go ahead and just briefly mention that we have a couple great grand rounds coming up in the next couple weeks. Dr. Michael Snyder will be presenting on wearables and early detection of COVID-19 using wearables. And the week after that, we have renal involvement of COVID-19 with Doctors Anand, Parsonett, and Roth. For our special presenter today, I'm going to ask our department chair, Dr. Harrington, to introduce them. So Dr. Harrington, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me today to be able to introduce our speaker, longtime mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Rob Califf. Rob's a graduate of Duke University and Duke University Medical School. And then following that, he made his first trip west to the Bay Area, where he was a resident at UCSF. He returned to Duke and spent the next several decades at Duke, first as a cardiology fellow and then as a longtime member of the Duke faculty. Many of you, I think, listening will know Rob's accomplishments. He was the longtime director of the Duke Databank for Cardiovascular Disease, the founding director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, the Duke Translational Research Institute, and Duke Forge, which is the data science center at Duke. Most recently at Duke, he was the vice chancellor for data science, for health data sciences. Rob then took a leave from Duke, where he was the former FDA commissioner under President Obama. And then following all of that, he's retired from Duke and moved west, where he's picked up his life and his career working at Verily Life Science as well as Google Health, where he serves in each organization as the head of strategy for the head of clinical policy strategy and as an advisor to both CEOs. I can't think of someone better to give us his insights on reflections of dealing with COVID from his perspective as a former FDA commissioner, as well as somebody intimately involved with testing across the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rob, and we look forward to it.
Great, thanks, Professor Harrington. As I've commented many times, it's great to have someone who was a mentee become your boss, since I'm an adjunct faculty member. So this is my opportunity to earn my status so that I continue to get faculty rates on the Stanford golf course, one of the most important things for exercise for me. So I thought I really appreciate the chance to reflect on what we've been going through. And I don't really pretend that this is easy by any means for anyone involved. I mean, we are suffering from a pandemic, fires, racial strife, and an election coming up. So there's a lot going on, and but what I do plan to do is to end each little section with a question oriented at academic medicine and academic medical centers. So first of all, just a few disclaimers and comments. I am an employee of Verily Life Sciences and Google Health. I have adjunct appointments at Duke and Stanford, but my primary employment is in big tech. This content reflects my personal views in grappling with the pandemic, not the official policies of Google in particular. And the work I talk about is not my own, but reflects experience now in all the different sectors. I can't think of a sector that I haven't participated in this time, and I don't know if it's made me wiser or more confused, but you can form your own judgment about that when you hear what I have to say. And while there's a lot that tech companies could do better, this lecture is going to focus on universities and academic health systems. I still love them, even though this may sound a bit half empty, because it is my belief that academia and universities can step it up a notch, because I think it's really desperately needed by our society right now. And my main consideration upon reflection is that the factors that have led to poor performance of the U.S. healthcare system were laid bare by the pandemic, resulting in an equally poor performance. The problem's not a lack of technology, and I think that's obvious to everybody. It's a lack of organization, focus, and attention to the basics. Built into this is my view that the best measure of success of a healthcare system is the survival, functional status, and quality of life of the population, not the profitability of the system. Although I fully recognize I work for a company that makes a lot of money, and that everyone has to make money in order to do its business. And so I'd say the pandemic has exposed our issues, mostly related to fragmentation, misalignment of payment, and misalignment between payment and the public health need. And I don't think one sector can solve this, but it may be worth asking, what can our nation's powerful and wealthy academic health systems do? So first of all, the slides that I feel like I always have to show, just to make the point that we didn't go into the pandemic in the best shape in terms of the things that really matter. We have tremendous disparity in longevity, for example, in our country that has been going on for a long time, but accelerating over the last few years before the pandemic, mostly broken down in an eerie manner that looks a lot like the political system. And I don't know why demographers made longer life blue and shorter life red, but you'll see the really pretty strong correlation between the voting status of counties in the United States and longevity. But it's also kind of interesting to realize that the patterns are changing, and while race remains a really major factor that I think we all know that we have to really focus on, particularly given the fact that we haven't come close to solving the problem yet. In addition to that, we now have this really strong trend where the greatest change in life expectancy is happening in men who live between West Virginia and Oklahoma, that sort of belt of red that you see there on the slide. The sum effect of this is a bad performance. If you take the top high-income countries in the world, they've all seen steady increase in longevity, while the U.S. has been flat or declining, particularly in the last few years. And I would expect that when all the numbers come in the pandemic year, we're also gonna look worse. Not that the other countries are gonna look great, but I worry that this last place status with a widening gap between us and next to last is going to continue to expand. This is one of my favorite slides, stolen off of Twitter, but it's an old slide that's shown all the time by health economists that shows health expenditure on one axis, life expectancy on the other. As Kevin Schulman would point out, the U.S. is not a particularly good purchase when it comes to healthcare, we're much more expensive with a lousier result. And arguments will go on forever about what has caused this, but the trends are not looking more promising over time. And at least one pundit on Twitter pointed out that way back in the 1970s, you know, despite the fact that many of the same factors were in play, we didn't look that different than other high-income countries. But the gap has really widened over time. All of them have decided to make healthcare a right and to have a focus on a primary care system. We went the high-tech route, and whether that's coincidence or just association or cause and effect, we could argue about, but I certainly believe there's something to this slide. And so I think when you have a system which is not geared up for the public health or with a robust primary care system, without a lot of trust in the public health system, you end up with a difficulty responding to a pandemic. And if we look at deaths per 100,000 in the latest thing I could pick up from Hopkins, we're in the worst tier of countries at this point. And if you look at infection rates or prevalence, it's gotten real interesting lately with, you know, this big gap between the US and Europe, for example, that looked very pleasing to people who were pro-Europe. But of course, Europe is now going through a fairly significant, a very significant second wave. So regardless of where we end up over the next few months, it's very difficult to say that we've done a better job of responding to the pandemic than other countries that are in the same economic status as us. So the one slide I will show about big tech and digital health is something that I think is really important. As a part of our response, there's a question out there right now as to whether the digitization, which we all went to during the pandemic, is raising up everyone, or is it advantaging people who already had access to things like high-speed internet even more in this relatively dire time? And I think in addition to the many things that we need to pay attention to, this issue of how to use digital technology to improve low-income and high-income people, previously advantaged and disadvantaged people, is a major issue. All right, so now to get to the part where I have questions for you guys, and I really look forward to the discussion section. I'm going to cover 6 major points that are listed here, but we'll go through them one at a time. And these are things that I've just observed and struggle with as I've worked from my role in the pandemic and thought about what might happen after the upcoming election, where either whoever wins is going to have a major job to think about how to reshape our approach to this problem. So the first point is that people need reliable, authoritative information in a format that helps them live healthier lives. And that holds for in the pandemic and outside the pandemic, but it's especially critical now. And the problem that we face is, while we might have a lot of great information, the way academics tend to put out information is not the way people like to see it. And so while the technology is really advancing and everyone has a cell phone now, I don't think we can take it for granted that people are really getting access to the information they need in the way that they need it. Now, just, I love to show these slides just to make the point. Dr. Harrington is old enough to remember the days when a great House officer was someone who could go to the library, find the journal, and make a Xerox copy and hand it out. But that's now been replaced by this. Everyone, whether you're a medical expert or the average person on the street, or even someone living in poverty, expects to get information instantaneously through the cell phone or some other connection to the broad-based information on the internet. And you can see here, this is a couple of years old now, 16 million results on search every half a second. And so we've been working to, for COVID, to elevate authoritative information to the top of the screen where people look at it. So this is a look at the search page, which has a knowledge panel on it. It focuses on reputable press and information. And, I'll let you all address in the Q&A what the reliable sources are right now for information for the public about what to do about the pandemic. It's certainly something that we're struggling with in the Alphabet universe. I'll also point out something that most of you already know, but I certainly didn't know enough about it until I saw it firsthand. But there's a whole generation of people who rarely read anything. They look at videos all day. And so YouTube has become a major source of information for people. And it has all the same issues that I showed you in search. In addition to that, our geo section that does maps, if we think about the upcoming likelihood of the need for mass vaccination, our role in the testing at Verily has been to conduct a lot of the testing, but on the Google side, the real role is to help people find the testing centers. And a major effort has gone into not only surfacing where the centers are, but enough information about them so that people can plan how to use them and make sure they have the right information when they go to the testing center. But having said all that, I think there's a fundamental question that I look forward to the discussion on. What can academic medical centers and health systems do to increase the availability of reliable, authoritative, and high quality information in a format that really gives the public what they need in the way they like to see it? And I would just say, as we're searching for authoritative, useful information, it's hard to find exactly what we'd like to have at the top of the search page. That's my second point, which I almost feel like should go without saying, is our public health infrastructure. It served us well for many decades, but it really needs a major upfit right now. It's not working particularly well in the pandemic. And this is a list of things that I think are important from my observations. There's a lack of confidence in what comes from the public health system, because it's partly because it's been so politicized and people are not confident about the source of the information. Our civil servants have been maligned, and I think you're all aware that many county public health officials in the state of California have had major threats, and more than a couple have had to resign for the safety of their families. And certainly, having been the FDA Commissioner, I'm very sensitive to the importance of keeping the morale in the federal system for public health. And I think it's going to be important that all of us do what we can to get the word to people that they need to support this system. Also, I should go without saying, the computing infrastructure right now leaves a lot to be desired. And just trying to get basic information about testing and outcomes, and it's been a nightmare. And like people like you guys at Stanford have done a really nice job of cobbling together the information, and it's getting better. But fundamentally, I can tell you for sure, the computing infrastructure of HHS needs a redo to get into the modern age. And then we got to do something about documentation. We're a federalist country. People value their independence at every level, but the disarray and lack of coordination has really hurt people's ability to get what they need in this difficult time. And then on top of all that, because we have a disaggregated system, it's really essential that we get better coordination between the public and the private sectors. Just the issue of public health testing versus testing in the academic medical centers has been really interesting to watch. and participate in the state of California. And we've certainly appreciated the work that Stanford has done to coordinate with us at Verily. But across the whole state, there have been many problems because the information is not at people's fingertips to know exactly how to coordinate. And then lastly, the fee-for-service system just doesn't deliver public health. It delivers great health for people who can pay to get the best, but it doesn't do a great job, as evidenced by all the data I showed at the beginning of this talk. And just to make the point, there are like 100 examples I could give, but one that I ended up being very involved with, I think everyone remembers when we were all afraid we were going to be short of ventilators. And it turns out making a ventilator is not that hard to do. And we have great ventilator manufacturers in the United States and Europe, but they had all designed their plants to be just in time, finely tuned to the supply and demand that was expected in normal times, and no resilience for an emergency. And so then when they decided they needed to gear up for the emergency and the government asked them to, it turned out the supply chains were completely disrupted and were also suffering from exactly the same thing. There was no connection. And we had the opportunity to put together a fairly simple website that just connected the suppliers of the major parts for ventilators with the companies that could actually make the ventilators. And this made a difference, but there was no system to make this happen, which certainly gave me a number of sleepless nights early on in the pandemic. We had a relatively minor role, but it's obvious we're still suffering in many places with regard to PPE, for example, because of the same issues. So I'd ask here, what can academic medical centers and health systems do to directly contribute to a more effective public health system? Can highly effective local models be created? I notice that Dr. Harrington's colleague, Wachter, is at Grand Rounds tomorrow, is going to be on the San Francisco response, which looks spectacular. I would say the whole Bay Area has done well. So it's hard for me to get on Stanford in this regard because I think, the numbers speak for themselves. And I wonder, though, if we look around the country, is the lack of coordination an artifact of the fact that we're living in this fee-for-service, not-for-profit system that drives us to focus on not on the things that are most important, but on the things that create the margins that we need to run our systems in the current effort. So, I think it raises the question big time as we come out of the pandemic, what can we do to get the system so that people get paid to do what's most important and get alignment between the payment system and the public health. Next point is that without evidence generation, we're over the horizon in a storm with no compass. And I just say it that way because I once actually did capsize on a sailboat, on a catamaran over the horizon while a storm was coming in. And there was no way to have any earthly idea what direction we were going. And fortunately, the Coast Guard had helicopters and went out hunting for us and found us. But, when we look at the treatment approaches to the pandemic, we started knowing essentially nothing. We had some Bayesian prior knowledge from other pandemics and other coronavirus outbreaks. And that sort of got us through, but then chaos ensued where people were doing all kinds of crazy things, all sorts of belief about what was working and not working, and no real good system to figure out what was effective and what was not. And this is not a mystery to us. We know how to figure out what's effective and what's not. It's called doing the randomized clinical trial, but we just weren't ready to kick it into action, despite the fact that the federal preparedness plan that was left behind from the Obama administration, one of the most important things it said was in a pandemic, do RCTs right away so that you focus on the treatments that work and don't spend all your money and energy on treatments that may actually do more harm than good. But unfortunately, in this country, we're still on the left-hand side, despite efforts to move us to the right-hand side. The left-hand side is a very inefficient system with one-off clinical trials answering one question at a time. The right-hand side that we hope to have one day would be constant surveillance with outcome measurement and then embedding clinical trials in the healthcare system to drastically reduce the cost and through secondary use of electronic health record data, make it much more efficient to collect the information that we need to figure out what works. And of course, to embed randomization into that system where it's most effective. Now, again, in 2016, we put together sort of the blueprint from HHS about what needed to happen. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'll just refer you to this New England Journal article from 2016 that sort of laid out what we thought needed to happen. There's nothing surprising in here. We just haven't done it yet. And so, you know, as we look at the disarray that we've had, this is my list, and I won't dwell on this either, but just make the point that it was amazing, despite the disarray, the amount of volunteerism and risk-taking and courage that was shown by healthcare workers and researchers and health systems to rush through contracts and change consent was done. It's really quite a remarkable response. We just lack the organization to make it effective and efficient. And I think we need to look back now and ask the question of all the things we did to speed things up, what do we need to keep, and what didn't work that we need to take back, and how can we continue the drive to employ digital technology so that we free up the human effort to do the things that we need people in order to do. And I've got a list of sort of ideas here and happy to share them later. I think all I need to say is hydroxychloroquine, and people understand what I'm saying. Why 40% of our clinical trials were testing hydroxychloroquine when there were so many other issues that needed to be addressed, and why so many of our trials can't possibly answer the critical questions because they're tiny studies done in single academic medical centers for the most part. And, you know, as Dr. Harrington knows, I like to sort of make fun of the effort he's involved in with ACTIVE compared to the UK, which got organized and reeled off 3 or 4 really critical answers right away by using the National Health Service. The docs there were participated as part of their jobs in the clinical trials, and the most important questions were served up, or as I like to say, they were answering questions while we were still having academic committee meetings. So I think the question is, what can academic medical centers and health systems do to help align the evidence generation system with high quality studies? Or is this someone else's problem? Because our academic systems have been focused on the high tech, high science part of it and not on the public health interest so much. And how much of the problem is the culture of credit and academic advancement versus the potential culture of rewarding contribution to the most important generalizable knowledge. The next point is major improvements are needed in our diagnostic testing system. And I had a lot of experience with this as FDA Commissioner. This is just a list of pre-pandemic observations. It would have been nice if I had been able to help straighten this out, but we couldn't. Very difficult to get where I thought we needed to go. And I think it's easy to see that in our culture, we have a proliferation of tests because the criteria for getting a test on the market are much easier than, for example, getting a drug or a vaccine on the market. And I think it's appropriate, it should be easier. The question though is, what can we do to develop better evidence about how tests really operate in the real world and how they should be used in decision making? And it's very easy to demonstrate that literacy about operating characteristics of tests, even among health professionals, is rudimentary. And they tend to be seen as positive or negative or normal, abnormal, rather than probabilistic exercises. Again, like most of what I'm talking about here, technology is not the problem. It's really the major impact of the payment system on willingness to invest in new tests and evidence about the value of tests, which I think is holding us back from what we really need. So we take the system that's somewhat dysfunctional into the pandemic, and lo and behold, there's a lot of confusion. The supply chain doesn't work. The cost issues lead to massive suboptimization of allocation of tests. And the integration of test results with decision making is difficult because we don't have good evidence of exactly how to use the tests. Now we have such a proliferation of tests that we really have to go back now and understand the operating characteristics of the tests, the different purposes that we now know we need for the public health. None of this was a mystery, but it just wasn't fixed. And we certainly had our own experience with this. We're now over 1 million tests done in our system, which is focused on getting community testing done, and then asking people to participate in a registry with a handoff to RCTs where appropriate to also advance knowledge. And I just say that despite all the negativism I'm appearing to give, the volunteerism of people and their willingness to participate is really quite remarkable. So we got the raw material, we got the technology, we just have to get the systems together. And we're also very involved in return to work and school, including with the Stanford regular campus, as you know. And at least this is the way that I can say we look at it, which is that you've got a lot of inputs now and an increasing amount of empirical data. And we've got a lot of outputs that are needed for individual universities or individual businesses or companies to make decisions about who should come back to work, what the work conditions should be, and what testing strategies should be used. And I think it's very amenable to an empirical learning engine, and we're working on that. And it needs to be obviously different depending on the purpose that the testing is using. We just had a little article come out in Stat this morning, and we've become converts now. We're doing pool testing, but we've now also become converts of the cheap, fast test concept. But it's been really interesting as I've talked to a lot of people about this. It's really hard for the average clinician to get the mind wrapped around the fact that if you have suppressed the local effect of the pandemic with a low prevalence rate, that the vast majority of these tests are going to be, if they're positive, are going to be, vast majority of positive tests are going to be false positives. And so understanding how the particular test fits into the strategy, I think, is a big part of the work we have ahead of us as we enter the fall and winter. So I think this is a big job for academic medical centers, not just to do the test, but to teach people about how to use the tests. And I think we're all experiencing the suffering that local schools and school boards are having dealing with this. And I hope that there's a big NIH grant afoot to link up academic experts with school boards and school systems to make this more rational. And I hope this takes off and will take us into a different era of testing in the future. And then finally, in order to realize, next to the last, in order to realize the benefits of changes in computation, we need a new societal approach to privacy and security. And I like to show this slide just to make the point that we've rapidly moved now from sort of very focal knowledge about human biology, behavior, and environment to what we always knew was important, which is the ability to measure the whole human being and the environment in which the human being is operating. But we haven't figured out how to convert this into actionable knowledge that will help us deal with things like a pandemic. Now, I'm very proud of the effort that's gone on with all of my alma maters and relationships here with Project Baseline. There's great work going on here, and I noticed Mike Snyder next week with you guys, also great work there. So, and just to show some of the things that I think are having an impact in the pandemic, obviously the ability to measure mobility is something that both Apple and Google can do on a grand scale. And the publication of the mobility data specific to different locations has been useful for public health. And at the individual level, we have exposure notification. And I'm not going to dwell on these slides because I think you all know about it, but it's fully possible to notify someone they've been exposed to someone with the virus if both parties are willing and consent, and doing it without revealing identity. But that's not enough, of course. Eventually, one needs identity to do contact tracing, and those systems are now being rolled out. But we have a major societal problem, obviously, with confidence in the system. And I would argue this is a paradigm for all of medicine, that we'll be much better at caring for individuals and populations if people share data. So if we assume that that's the case, the question is not whether we share data, it's how we do it. And I would just say we haven't figured this out, obviously. And I think this is not something the tech companies can or should figure out. It's something I think universities, with all their assets, should be very focused on right now. All right, now the last one, which I think might generate the biggest discussion, and it's obviously the topic of the week. And I just want to put forward the concept that we're headed for a test of the fundamental fabric of our biomedical system as we interpret the vaccine trial data. And just a refresher on this, back in the good old days when I was FDA Commissioner and we were going at a routine pace, developing a new vaccine was a multi-year procedure with a lot of checks and balances, a lot of ability to analyze data in great detail, and to take all this mid-steps that might be needed as you work through all the issues in a vaccine development program. And I think it's entirely appropriate that warp speed, as it's been called, is trying to go at warp speed and doing a lot of things in parallel that have remarkably sped up vaccine development. The FDA, now that we're nearing the time when results may be available, has set out the criteria, at least a 50% reduction in symptomatic infections, which means the lower confidence interval could be as low as 30%. And very different criteria for approval by law. When I was commissioner, the current guidance was put out about emergency use authorization. And essentially what it says is that in the time of a nuclear war, a nuclear catastrophe, a severe situation such as a hurricane or tornadoes or a pandemic, the FDA has authority to speed up authorization to put products on the market. And instead of requiring demonstration of safety and effectiveness, what's required is that the potential and demonstrated benefits outweigh the potential and demonstrated risks. So this gives the FDA tremendous leeway in terms of making a decision about what goes on the market. But it's also important to remember that the FDA is part of the executive branch of the government, and it is a chain of command that goes from the civil service in the FDA to the politically appointed commissioner, to the HHS secretary, and then to the president. And the statute says that all of the authority actually resides with the HHS director. And up until just this last week, it was, as a matter of normal course, delegated to the FDA commissioner. And it was also the norm, with only one or two known exceptions in the history of the FDA, that the politically appointed commissioner would not meddle with decisions being made by the career civil servants who report up to the relevant centers, in this case, the Biologics Center headed by Peter Marks. And traditionally, part of the commissioner's job is to protect the civil service by serving as the buffer between the politicians who have every right in our law and society to ask questions and to push as best they can. But there's a balance there that's existed in the past. But it's important to realize that by law, the HHS secretary can overrule anybody in the FDA, and the president has the power to hire and fire the HHS commissioner at will, which means the president, if the desire was there, could control this. Now, it's a little bit interesting that the trials that are currently in the lead are nearing completion of enrollment. It's fascinating that each one is a little bit different. The study protocols are out and on the internet if you want to look at them. As usual, I went to Eric Topol's Twitter feed to get the latest information, and some of them have much more liberal stopping rules than others. And so even at 32 primary events, the Pfizer trial could be stopped at the first interim analysis, but it would require a very small p-value. Now, as reported by the Washington Post yesterday, the FDA may come out with a new guidance in the next day or two that would say we've got to have more safety data than just 32 cases to start distributing a vaccine. But this will all play out over the next month or two. And I think the most important issue that people at places like Stanford need to be thinking about is that we, of course, there's a saying at FDA, in God we trust, all others must bring data. So, and the data will be publicly available as assured by the commissioner and Peter Marks, the head of the relevant division at FDA. But it's entirely possible that the results could be ambiguous and that there may not be agreement in government, but a decision will be made as to whether to make the vaccine available and distribute it. And what I believe is most important is that people will not get vaccinated unless a healthcare professional does the vaccination. And that means that the most important issue is going to be whether we can reach a consensus in the clinical and biomedical community about the interpretation of the data. So I'll stop with this slide, which got off the internet, and I think pretty summarizes the times that we're in. I hope these questions have been provocative enough that you'll think about them, particularly this last segment. Really, really important that there's a vibrant discussion about what all this means as this big decision comes up for us. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk, and I look forward to the discussion.
Dr. Califf, thank you for that really insightful talk, and that picture really says 1,000 words. As expected, thank you so much for providing your insights, both from academia and from industry. It's really valuable, and I can see from the questions that are coming up, people are taking advantage of having you with us today to ask some challenging questions, some really good questions. And I'll ask everybody to please keep asking questions, and also take a look at the ones that are already up there so you can vote up the ones that are maybe similar to that question you may have. The first question here asks, are you concerned that we are devolving into a vaccine Cold War with nationalization of vaccines? If so, what can or should an academic institution do about this?
We are, I mean, I don't know what the right term is, but if I just accepted Cold War as a term, we are in a Cold War about masks. I mean, I'm in North Carolina right now, and if you go to rural North Carolina, you'll see people purposely not wearing masks and making comments to people who do wear masks about it. And I think vaccines, there's a real risk of the same thing. So this is really my point. I do not think there should be a limit on the amount of discussion that occurs in our most trusted medical centers and among their alumni to get prepared for how to assess the result of the trials. And because there is a division that's very significant in how people will look at benefit and risk, I think it's unlikely the results will be totally obvious and clean, and there will be differences of opinion. So, at least the way I grew up, the only way to resolve these kind of things is by talking about them in an open way. That also means, by the way, I know you all have had your own controversies at Stanford about voices of faculty. And so I think, my personal opinion is we'd better be very tolerant of people saying what they really think. Because I think the worst thing that can happen is for people not to be heard and to lash out in ways that create harm.
Well, Rob, let me push you a little bit on that one. As you know, because it was in the public sphere, it's good also that we have Dr. Singh with us, who's one of the signatories to the piece that came out of a group of faculty at Stanford challenging Scott Atlas's expertise. As you know, he quickly, or his lawyers quickly issued cease and desist letters to those individuals as well as to the institution, If we're going to be reliable sources of information and we're going to encourage open public discourse, how do we deal with that? I mean, it's pretty tough to have a junior faculty member get a cease and desist letter, or we're going to basically ruin you. That's tough stuff to deal with.
Well, I think Stanford's a pretty powerful institution and should stand behind its faculty. I mean, Dr. Atlas has a right to express his opinions. And I think other faculty members have a right to point out where there is a consensus that goes against those opinions that's held by the vast majority of the faculty. And I do not think that, I think the institution needs to protect its faculty in those conditions. Bob, you and I went through some similar things. You know, I was the recipient of a Dingle investigation, and the fact that Duke University stood behind me, actually in front of me in several situations, you know, was really, really important at an early phase of my career, because we were, you know, we just got trial results that some people didn't like. That's basically what happened. And that could happen here too.
And you and I certainly remember being hauled into federal court when we published a paper that said a device didn't work and in fact might be harmful. And Duke stood by us.
Great, thank you. Next question. Isn't it exactly the word or payment model or rhetoric on a society level that has spurred the technological growth but lack of organization? What channels does academia have to encourage staff internally and the public externally to discuss or contribute to the mindset or rhetoric that can encourage a more balanced and comprehensive growth?
This is where I always get into trouble, but I'll go ahead and say what I think. I mean, I think right now the big academic centers have a huge conflict because their profit is mostly driven by fee-for-service or derivatives of fee-for-service that are called value-based, but don't really get to the full force of value-based payment. And so it's very hard to say we want to change the system when we're taking that money in a not-for-profit system and putting it into research and paying for students and other things. But I think the price we're paying for it is fully evident in the deterioration of our public health in this country. And it's not solely due to, you know, people say, well, it's not due to healthcare delivery, it's due to social determinants. But I think now we know that all of us have a digital footprint that we can integrate information in a way we couldn't before to make sure people do get social services in addition to traditional health services. So I hope the academic centers in the renaissance after the pandemic will step forward more and go at risk more in payment systems that reward better overall health for people in communities. That's my great hope.
Great. Dr. Califf, we have a question come from one of our panelists, Dr. Ben Pinsky, who's been critical and very crucial to us establishing testing since everything started. He's been a huge help for us. He's asking, could you comment on the FDA emergency use authorization process for COVID-2 diagnostic testing? What is your opinion on the role of laboratory developed tests in response to the pandemic?
I took a lot of hits about my view that laboratory tests need to be regulated, and I actually still believe they should be regulated, but it'd be a long discussion to say how I believe they should be regulated. What I'd say is that, you know, there were a couple of, there was an initial error that was made in not promoting more development of new tests for COVID when the decision was made to rely on the CDC, and then the test turned out to be faulty. And then the criteria were too rigid. And then it veered too much in the other direction by making it easy to put out tests, particularly when serologic tests were just hitting the market, and we flooded the market with useless antibody tests due to that. And now we're getting closer to something that's, I think, reasonable. So I'm very much in favor of LDTs, but I also think we need to have a system. We need to have a system where if you go to 3 different major medical centers, you don't get 3 different results that take you down 3 different sets of decisions. And there's just too much of that that's gone on in the pre-pandemic era, and I wouldn't want to replicate that in the current era.
Got it. Another question here, how is Google and other high-tech platforms working on misinformation circulating online? Are there medical people assessing information through the literature? And secondly, did Verily, after its testing, help with funding contact tracing? This is not to distract from the kudos of stepping to the plate, and I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go too many questions here.
The issue of misinformation is a big topic, and it consumes a lot of people at Google, but I don't think any of us believe that a perfect job is being done. But this is where I throw it back at you guys, because in essence, Google is a surface on which information exists, and society, there's a general societal agreement that certain types of information need to be taken off immediately, like promoting suicide or child abuse and that sort of thing. But trying to get two academic medical centers to agree on what the right answer is to just a mundane question, it's really difficult. And so I really hope there'll be a robust acceleration of societal discussion about what it means to be reliable and authoritative. We have made an exception for COVID under Karen DeSalvo's leadership. There's a very active promotion of what we think is most reliable. But in this era where the CDC is contested as to whether it's politically driven or scientific, it's really hard to get this right. I know that sounds a bit evasive, but the basic answer is we're trying, it's imperfect, but we need everybody to step up, particularly the places that should be most trusted, like you are.
Great. Dr. Harrington, can you comment on that as well?
Yeah, Rob, I want to ask you a follow-up to one of the questions you asked us, which was the role of the academy in putting out reliable information. I mean, we've seen our duty over the years as being to do good science and to publish things in the peer-reviewed literature. But as you've talked about, that's not what people in the general public are reading. They're looking for other media sources. What do you think should be the role of academics on social media? I mean, after the publications come out, in all seriousness, should we be on Twitter? Should we be making TikTok videos, YouTube videos? What should we be doing?
Well, who am I to say, really? But I mean, I think you know how I feel about this. I think academic medical centers made a decision, during our lifetimes to become academic health systems with a very broad reach. I think you're no exception at Stanford. You have an enormous primary care system. And so with that comes accountability and responsibility to educate your vast numbers of patients. And they are not going to read New England Journal articles except for your faculty who will come in as patients with article in hand. I think somehow we're going to, so if you said, whose responsibility is it? If it's not integrated health systems responsibility, I don't know who would take that responsibility. There is no other primary source right now. So somewhere between the health systems, the professional societies, and government entities, there has to be a different fabric of knowledge. And we just know that if you give somebody with a second grade education a reading level, something that's written for a college graduate, it's not going to be very effective. So that this is really important work that needs to be done.
Great. Dr. Califf, I got a question here in the chat. Dr. Leeper asks, can we learn anything from the vaccines that are being widely deployed in China and Russia? Are they working? Are they effective?
I think that's a great question, and all I can say is the short answer is yes, but I'm not at liberty to reveal anything because I don't, there's no definitive information at this point. But I do think between the government and other sources, we will get a read. Because as you know, the Chinese and Russian vaccines are being deployed in other countries already. certainly for Google, which is a global employer of 130,000 people, this is already an issue. Should our employees go out and buy Chinese or Russian vaccines? I don't know the answer, but we're going to do everything we can to learn.
Great. It's 9 o'clock now. Do you mind if we go over a little bit? We have so many questions we just won't have time to get to, but if we can get through a few more, if we
Okay.
thanks so much. Thanks for sticking with us. Dr. Kaplan asked, the FDA has scheduled a meeting of vaccines and biologic committee for October 22nd, just 2 weeks before the election. The agenda will not be made public 2 days before the meeting. Do we need to worry about an EUA without clear evidence of safety and effectiveness?
Short answer is yes. But worry and certainty are two different things. And so this is really a key point I was trying to make. The chain of command would enable under an EUA, remember it's potential benefits against potential risks. And, if you think about this in the context of the overall EUA guidance, let's say there was a nuclear war, you wouldn't want the FDA doing, extensive studies of hematopoietic cell rescue in victims of nuclear attack. And, this is a little less immediate, but certainly not unreasonable to think about, not having complete information and making a decision. So what do we do with worry? Well, I think places like Stanford should spend a lot of time talking about this and having as many people as possible understand the possible results and thinking ahead of time about how you might interpret them. There are only a limited number of configurations of results that could come up. Most of us think it's unlikely at that committee meeting that there'll actually be results ready to talk about. It'll probably be more of a discussion of the rules of the game. But the Pfizer CEO has said he thinks they probably will have results, so we'll see.
Got it. Question here that came up earlier, I thought was a good one. If academia can produce information in easy palatable formats and spend some money on the media strategy team, wouldn't it also take search engine companies to put academic sources at the top of the results? I'm slightly skeptical that academia has enough resources against the more powerful secondary media companies.
That's it. I mean, what I would say is that it's highly likely that, certainly speaking for Google, that if there's really agreement on definitive sources of information, it would rise to the top, at least in the health arena, because it is regarded as different. But again, I think the challenge is you're all competing against each other and you don't necessarily agree even on relatively straightforward things. So I think it's worth the effort. As to who has more resources, I don't know. I don't know if you all keep track of the Stanford endowment, but I think there's a lot of money there. I'm not sure the media companies have more ready cash than the Stanford endowment, for example. So I think it's a matter of priorities of how you choose to spend your money. But it's an interesting question, and I'll go back and look at that part of it.
Thank you. I'm going to jump back to another question on testing here in the chat, Dr. Karen Butterfield. What is the problem with ramping up tests with rapid results so patients could be informed promptly? An easy question.
Well, I mean, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's called discoordination. I mean, no, there's a thing called the Defense Production Act, which is another part of the national emergency response that gives the government the right to take control of supply chains and to order companies to produce. So if you think about the pictures you've seen from World War II of all of the mostly women at the time who were making munitions and tanks and everything that was needed to fight the war. For whatever reason, our administration has decided not to do that and to leave it more to the free market. And from my perspective, that's basically the problem. It's a discoordinated supply chain operating in a free market where people's decisions to ramp up have to do with what they think they're going to get paid to do it as much as anything else. And I think it needs to be done differently.
Great. I just want to mention to those of you putting comments, I'm going to leave those up. You're welcome to look at those comments as well, and I'll focus on the questions. But thank you, Dr. Barry and Marcus, for Dr. Marcus, for your comments as well. Another question here, Dr. Califf. Is it possible for you to disclose whether or how closely the healthcare arm barely works with the media arm Alphabets of Google, especially in terms of helping to determine what source info get prioritized?
Verily has absolutely no role in that. I mean, Alphabet is a family of companies. They are connected in infrastructure, but there's a firewall when it comes to the main engines on the Google side of search, YouTube and Geo with Maps, and there's 7 products that have over 1 billion users a day there. But I work on both sides, and Karen DeSalvo, the chief health officer, is very involved in issues of prioritization as they relate to health. So there is an active team, and some part-time Stanford faculty are involved on that team.
Great. Dr. Califf, I'll finish with one more question. Again, thank you for your time. Perhaps I'll jump to Dr. Euster Hussein's question. Can you comment on how a national healthcare system can make the response to the pandemic a better response? You mentioned healthcare as a human right. She says, I agree. How do we raise awareness?
Well, I mean, from my view, a national healthcare system that was integrated and where payment for services was aligned with population, better population outcomes, you would see things like coordination between the health systems and the public health testing that would make sure that people that needed testing got it, and would spend less on people that understand the system and can navigate it to get just the test they want because they want it. And you could well imagine in the treatment arena, getting people to the right places for treatment at the right time, which we all try to do within our own systems. But in the preamble, we were talking a bit with Dr. Harrington. He was, it's not necessarily smooth between Stanford and Kaiser, for example, all the time, because there's competition as well as collaboration. And as the vaccine gets rolled out, it's hard for me to think of how it's going to be done fairly without a well-coordinated national system. Even within the public health service, it's not very well coordinated. There's a lot of autonomy of counties, which works fine in non-stressful times. But, we just to give an example, we had a situation where we got a stockpile of testing supplies from FEMA in crates, and then the next day, a bunch of trucks pulled up and took it away, just as we were planning on deploying it. And there was no notice that it was coming, and we didn't know where it went. And these things could be done much better. And I don't need to remind anybody on this call about the disparities that we're seeing in COVID pandemic outcomes. It's pretty dire in my view, and directly related to low socioeconomic status and other disadvantages that just shouldn't be tolerated. We ought to put the most resources into dealing with those issues right now, and it's not happening at the rate that it should. And I think when the dust settles on toll of common chronic disease, not directly COVID related, but secondary, Dr. Harrington's done a great job of trying to let people know that you still need to get your heart attack treated, even if you're afraid of getting infected if you come to the hospital. But I think we're going to see this excess mortality much greater than the number of deaths counted from just the virus. So, I think it's easy to give generalizations like I've given. The details are complicated and could easily be messed up, and I fully acknowledge that. But I think we're too far on the other end of the spectrum right now and need to swing back to a more humane healthcare as a right system.
Dr. Califf. I usually get lots of good positive feedback on the great discussions after grand rounds. I'm already getting emails, texts, and chats saying what a great presentation this was and a great discussion. Thank you so much for spending the time with us this morning. It was extremely insightful, and we're really lucky to have you. So thanks for joining us. And to all our panelists, thank you for being with us as usual. And of course, thanks for the attendees for sticking after hour and listening to Dr. Califf speak. It's really, really valuable.
Yeah, I'd really love to emphasize, I like to be criticized. I got no problem. If people thought I said stupid things, let me know. I'll entertain that. After you've been interrogated by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Rand Paul all in one day, you can pretty much put up with any taunting from faculty and students. So take care.
Thanks so much, Dr. Califf. It's great to know. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.